Hello, members. A very warm welcome on a rather chilly evening. Welcome, everyone. I'm hoping that Mahesh, who is behind the scenes tonight, and I will be able to whisk you all away to the sunnier climes of Greece this evening as we explore the indigenous, or not all of the indigenous varieties. We'd need to be here for a week-long seminar at the very least, but some of the top indigenous varieties of Greece. I can see some of you already using the chat, so please do let us know where you are, if you're tasting along this evening with the three wines, or if you have something else perhaps. But remember to select everyone and not just hosts and panelists. Otherwise, it's only Mahesh and I that will be able to see you. Other than that, you are also welcome to use the Q&A tonight. We have got some time for questions. I've tried to time this one a bit tighter. I had this overexcitement, should we say, where I tried to fit in as many varieties as I possibly could, and I realized that my pronunciation would have struggled towards the end of an hour of pure Greek varieties and not much else. So I have left a bit of time for questions at the end, which hopefully, if you have any, you can pop in the Q&A. And other than that, I think that we're probably ready to get going. I've got some small slides tonight. There's nothing too taxing on there. But we've got Mahesh behind the scenes, managing the chat, managing the Q&A. So we should be ready to kick off. I thought I'd start, first things first, actually, with a map of Greece. Surprise, surprise. This evening's event could easily be one in which we explore all of the regions of Greece, or try to touch on a lot of the regions within Greece. It is, as you can see, an unbelievably fragmented wine-growing country, and I mean that in the most positive possible way. This sort of fragmentation leaves little pockets of production. Having an island off the mainland means that certain varieties thrive in its own little environment and don't get too much influence from the outside world. And what this really does is it means that Greece has an incredible diversity of production zones, not least because the landscape is so varied, but also that these indigenous grape varieties, some of which we're going to talk about this evening, have really thrived. I think realistically more than any other country that I can think of other than Italy. And naturally, obviously, France has a lot of incredible grapes. There's arguments to whether some of those are indigenous or not, etc. But certainly Italy is really the only country I can think of that comes close to having this sort of diversity still. And I think that's largely to do with the fact that Italy for a long time obviously was also separated and segmented, granted more politically than geographically like Greece is. But I think it's whilst it's been hardship for those countries, it's been fantastic for the world of wine. So we're talking about a country that's about 34 to 42 degrees on the latitude, which is warm, should we say, but actually most people consider Greek growing environments to be incredibly warm, and that's just not true. Not all of them are. There's huge coastal influence. I've read a fact about the amount of miles of Greece that is coastland, and it's just staggering. But you've got coastal influence, so that's going to moderate some temperatures. You've also got lots and lots of aspects. One thing that's very interesting about Greece is, yes, it's a coastal region, but it's not a coastal country or lots of coasts, but it's not flat. So actually mountainous and coastal is going to provide you with all of these incredible mesoclimates. You have things like continental plains, but then you have hot southern island wines. So of course, that also adds into the melting pot these options for diverse grape varieties. One thing that sort of unifies Greece, I would say, is that generally most areas do have, I don't want to say a problem with drought, but drought is very common. But a lot of these old varieties have been grown here for so many centuries that actually Greek grapes might become even more important in the future. Many of you may already know things like the very warm climate Portuguese grapes are now allowed in AOC Bordeaux to a certain small percentage. Maybe, you never know, some lesser known Greek varieties might be a thing that we look for in future years across the world and not just in Greece. What else would I like to say before we go on to talk about wines? I think the other thing is, the great thing about most Greek grapes, again slightly similar to Italy, is that they do hold their acidity quite well. Not always, but they're generally, the actual varieties themselves often have good high acid. However, historical Greek wine was very much sold depending on sugar levels. So you'd have lots of farmers, and in fact the setup in Greece is lots of small farmers. It's not these big huge producers. So a lot of the practices were quite old-fashioned. Again, something that's protected regional identities, but certainly there's been a revolution in terms of quality. So these small-scale farmers used to sell their grapes based on the sugar levels, and that's quite an archaic way of selling grapes. It's thing you can measure weight and sugar levels, and you say, yes, my grapes are really ripe, but actually what that would result in is, as those grapes are getting riper and the sugar levels are going up, there is a point towards the end of a grape ripening where the sugar still rises, but the acid drops. And often the grapes that were sold by Greek farmers would have got that drop in acid. So historically, some sort of flabbier wines, should I say, were produced. And that's just not really the case now. You don't have to make flabby wines. The acidity can hold. We're going to talk in a moment about the Santorini region as we go into our assyrtiko. And I want to bring it up quickly now just to say that we're going to look at a beautiful picture of some bush vines, particularly basket vines. I'll talk about those. But bush vines were very common in Greece or everywhere. And if anybody's been to the Rhone or Beaujolais or even Lodi in California, parts of southern Australia, you'll see vines literally grown as bushes. And that provides really good protection from the sun, but it is quite an expensive practice. And if you're not doing it right and you're not investing in it, it actually can be quite a challenging way of growing grapes as well. So universally, trellising is actually now more popular in Greece. But let's go on to it. What I would say is Santorini. Oh, don't know what's going on here. There we go. There you can see it now. So we're going to head to Santorini. And what's really special about Santorini for me is, first of all, it's clearly, it's an isolated island. But there are centuries and centuries and centuries of experience and a really unique condition going into this wine that for me makes it the perfect illustration of why Greece is so special as a wine growing country, and also what to look for in Greek viticulture and Greek wines, because it's really, in my opinion, one of the wine world's more magical wines. So I've asked or suggested, I should say, that you buy the exhibition Santorini Assyrtiko from 2021, but by all means, you don't have to have bought it. You could have any Assyrtiko from Santorini, and I should be clear, Assyrtiko is the grape variety. Any Assyrtiko from Santorini is likely, not always, but likely to be grown in this method. Why? So Santorini is hot. It is hot, hot, hot. It's also volcanic. So what's really interesting about this is we're talking about indigenous varieties, and there's an argument to say that this is not necessarily an indigenous variety. Everything was wiped out when the volcano erupted and when Santorini was formed of the volcanic mound, essentially. It means that the soils have very little organic matter. So grapes that do survive here are very special, and I would say that Assyrtiko is one of those. It is up there with sort of your noble white grapes of the world, in my opinion. It has this incredible ability to retain its acidity even in these very warm, very sunny conditions. And it's got a profile that I'm sure Mahesh won't mind me saying he doesn't really like, actually. It's quite salty, quite saline, very mineral. And those are all innately natural characteristics of assyrtiko, the grape. But the other thing is, as you can see from this picture, it's the farmers on the island, or vignerons, to use a French word that I'm not quite sure the Greeks would approve of, and I apologize for not knowing the Greek word. They this basket shape, and I think you can see it just as clearly in that first photo, this basket shape is to protect the grapes. So the vine grows around the outside, the grapes are actually in the center, and you can't see them here, but as the grapes grow, they sort of end up going into a bowl, and all of the leaves can still do the photosynthesis that's required, but the very, very harsh winds are protected. The grapes are protected from those very, very harsh winds. So it's very special. I wouldn't say unique. There's other parts of the world that do it, but realistically, this is the most famous basket trellised, if you can even call it that, variety and region in the world. So let's talk a little bit more about assyrtiko whilst you taste along with me, if you haven't already, and I don't blame you if you have. It's such a sort of, for me, the nose is just this enchanting, and I know Mahesh disagrees, so that's fine. We can all disagree politely. But for me, it's really enchanting. And if you like Chablis, you might like it. It's also got the acidity, some say, of Riesling. It can go a little bit petrol-y, a bit like Riesling, which is interesting. But it can also have this sort of salinity that if you don't like Fino sherry, you might find this just that bit too far on the scale. For me, it's heaven. It's absolutely perfect. The interesting thing, I won't talk about Malagousia now, but it is a good blending partner, and it actually blends well. So Malagousia is the I think it's now the most grown pardon me, white grape in Greece, and it's a good blending partner. The reason I say that is naturally, I mentioned already, the structure of assyrtiko is this lovely high acidity. So often you'll find that even if it's not a single varietal like this wine, it might be used in conjunction with others to just bring that fresh lift. It also can age really well. Now the blends, it depends what it's blended with, but the single varietal wines like this one can age well. They also drink beautifully young, but it's got this kind of, again, the high acid, low pH, usually just under 3. Low pH structure gives it that aging ability. It's rising in popularity as well. It is being planted in other parts of Greece, but Santorini is its ironically home, not home. It was imported, they think, by the Phoenicians, I think. And I think, and I could be wrong, and don't quote me on this, it's one of those things that I haven't fact checked, but you get told it and it becomes what you believe. But I think it's from Assyria, and that's where assyrtiko comes from. But please, and if there's any Greeks here who know that that's correct or incorrect, please don't say anything. But that's what I understand. There aren't really many other countries producing it. Australia is giving it a bit of a go, but realistically, the calling card is Santorini. This is the best place for it in the world. And this particular wine is 50 years average age grapes, and it's made for us by, I'm going to make a mess of his name, Artemis Karamolegios. And essentially, this winery it's quite a new winery in the grand scheme of things, but not a new vine growing family. So as far back as the 50s, current Artemis's grandfather, also called Artemis, was selling the grapes and selling a little bit of wine that he made at home, but not commercially. His son took over in the 90s. Again, it wasn't really a profession, but he was still selling some wine. And then finally, in 2003, current Artemis, the grandson of Artemis, the first wine seller, took over and has planted more of the indigenous varieties around the island, but also transformed the winery into this sort of modern quality, top quality production facility. And actually, their story pretty much tells the modern history of Greek viticulture. There was always a good leaning into good quality farming, and you'll see that throughout these wines. That wasn't the problem. The technology in the winery, they basically had really, really good raw ingredients. The grapes were good. The indigenous varieties were fabulous, but they were doing either the wrong thing to them and making wines that perhaps didn't suit what the grape could have been doing, or the wineries were, you know, there was no temperature control, for example, and things like that. So they're sort of little past 3 generations, in my mind, or to my mind, is a great example of how the Greek wine industry has evolved, with particular reference to how they've started taking really good quality grapes and transforming them into world-winning wine. And this is an award-winning wine. I can see Russell said, perfect with our chicken and feta phyllo pie tonight. Oh my God, tell me about it. Ken and Andrea, summer garden wine, but tonight isn't summer garden weather in Edinburgh. It's freezing. Quite agree. And I think for me, it's a great foodie wine. I'm going to taste it. I haven't even tasted it yet. It's got lovely lime, lovely salt, lovely sort of, I wouldn't say yeasty, but I think it has had some lees aging, if I remember correctly. But it's got enough texture. That's the really other interesting thing about assyrtiko. It's got quite a lot of phenolic grip in the skins. And actually, if you are, you know, playing around a little bit, giving it a bit of skin contact, you do get enough body, which I think is fabulous. I've had a good comment about Malagosea from Mark, who said it was almost extinct until it was revived. Correct. But it was revived around the 90s. So I didn't mean roditis, no. I'll go on to talk about both of them later. But Malagosea now is planted in more regions than any other white grape in Greece, to my knowledge. It's the most widely spread. It's not the, it's taken 30 years to produce, but it's now made in 30 different, so it's taken 30 years to get to this place, but it's made in 30 different wineries. So in 30 different areas and pockets. So it's sort of the one that's had this big explosion of, let's see what we can do with it. I'll talk about that in a minute anyway. I'm getting distracted about Malagosea. So where was I? Yes. So the lovely thing about this wine is it brings that texture, that grip, but with the beautiful finesse and the acidity. So I'm going to have a little taste and then we'll have to move on to some other white grapes. But I would say if you are looking for the wine to convert people, in my opinion, and Mahesh will disagree, but the wine to convert white wine lovers, that Greek wine is a fine wine or can be a fine wine, then this is it for me. I like that Emma said similar to Chablis as well. Oh, yum. So Julia said, I had the 2020 exhibition assyrtiko and I have some of the 21. I think it's a good example, not as hardcore as some, but very typical. I agree. I think Matthew has done a really good job choosing this for our exhibition wine, actually. We do have a slightly more affordable assyrtiko. It is more on the, and I don't mean this in a derogatory way, made in that more sort of zippy Sauvignon Blanc style, which is still absolutely delicious. But I think for me, this is definitely trying to move towards the Chablis, the bit of the richer texture, which is absolutely lovely. And James has said how the Wine Society has got this quality and great variety at this price impresses. And I agree. If you go hunting for it, assyrtiko is an expensive grape variety, but you did just see how it is grown, and you can only imagine, therefore, how it is picked. A big challenge, should we say the least. So let's move on to some other white grape varieties. So, well, first things first, there are over 300 grape varieties in Greece, and they're just the ones that have been identified. So I think there could be much more. There'll be much more. They are, or a lot of those varieties are actually made for table grapes, so that we're not talking about 300 identified wine varieties, and that's important to say. And a little bit like Italy, there are some of those grapes made in minute quantities just for the local markets, and so actually there's a huge wealth of grapes that we never see and that even other parts of Greece wouldn't see. And that's, I guess, where the conversation about Malagosea comes to the fore, because the travel between regions is less common in Greece. So it's a beautiful white grape, and as exactly Mark said, was basically extinct until the 90s, rediscovered, repurposed, given a new lease of life. And now it's taken 30 years to get there, but it has got it's spread and it's become popular. If you want to get an understanding of what it tastes like, it's quite tropical, very fruit forward, so much fruitier than the wine we've just tasted. I did mention that sometimes the assyrtiko can be added to it to bring the acidity up. That's often if producers, it doesn't have to be, but producers often want to get, oh, well, let's make it so tropical and friendly. And it's true, it's a really hard variety to hate. It's so gorgeously fruity, but sometimes producers run the risk of leaving it on the vine a little bit too long. And so therefore it can go a little bit overly tropical, and therefore sometimes needs pepping up with the assyrtiko. But there are some really good quality ones being picked early. Annoyingly, we don't have any for sale at the moment, but I'm going to get on to Matthew about that, our Greek buyer, because there are some good ones. It's just more of the vast majority are made in this kind of friendly, lovely, jubbly style, rather than a fine wine, should we say. But if you are shopping around for it and you see on the back of the label early picked, then you know you're into a good thing. So let's talk about some other white grapes, and then we're going to taste the rosé, which I haven't poured yet. It's keeping nice and cold for me. But the rosé is 2 white grapes and a red grape. And so we'll do it as a sort of intermediary, but I'll talk through some white grapes first. So lovely grape called Savatiano, really light berries, very drought tolerant. It's not actually particularly high acid. And I mean that in good acid way, acidity rather than bitter. And you often find that it's blended with things like roditis, which have got this lovely zingy acidity. But good examples on good sites are great. And it's often used for retsina. And I feel like we should address the elephant in the room whilst we have it. Retsina, where do we start with retsina? Retsina was poorly made, and most of them still are, lots of them still are. But one of the problems, particularly with retsina, and assyrtiko went into things like Vinsanto and did the same. I mentioned that the production methods weren't particularly high tech until the more recent years. And one of the problems with retsina, as with Vinsanto from Santorini, is that there was quality grape material going into there, but they were oxidizing. And so actually what used to happen particularly with retsina is you were having this resin, so this pine resin, added and macerated into your wine, which already provides you with a slightly unusual flavor. But lest we forget, there are some beautiful herbaceous white wines around the world. So you only have to look at Falangina, Fiano, I mean your Garganegas that go into Soave. So a lot of Italian grapes are incredibly herbal. Sauvignon Blanc can be a really herbaceous wine. So retsina shouldn't be put off just for being herbal. But when it's overly herbal and you lose all the grape character, that's no fun. And when it's oxidized, that's no fun. So I wish I could recommend you a really wonderful one to spend your money on, and I'm not sure I can. But what I can say is do try them when you get opportunity. There's a big Greek tasting going on in Greece at the moment. Try them if you get a chance. They're great fun, and they do not taste as they used to taste, to my understanding. I wasn't around to taste them 30 years ago, but they don't taste as bad as the storybooks have told me, put it like that. So let's whiz through some more white grapes and go on to our rosé before it gets too warm. So there is a lovely grape, probably for me the one to watch, called Robola, not Ribolla from northeast Italy, Robola, R-O. And it's probably it's the most famous export, I would say, from Catalonia. Lemony, fresh, lovely high acidity. It's very limited to the Ionian Islands, so taste it if you get a chance. That really is summer in a glass. Fish dishes, Greek dishes, salads, you name it, it goes with it. And for me, probably the one to watch. I've only had a couple, a handful of them, and they've all been great. So Robola is an interesting one. And then we move on to let's talk about pink-skinned grapes. Now we have got we've got 2 pink-skinned grapes in our rosé. But when I say pink-skinned, I mean like a Pinot Gris. So they can make white wines. That's not why our wine is pink. I want to make that clear before we start. There is a red grape in here as well. But moschofilero is white in the center, this off-color pink-ish Pinot Gris color, very perfumed. So moschofilero, if you're going to compare it to anything, compare it to a Muscat, I would say. Light, delicate white wines. There's sort of a great high plateau in the Peloponnese where this thrives. And it keeps its acidity. It really retains it, keeps it cool. Sometimes made into a sparkling wine, but they're quite rare. I wouldn't say that I've come across them. And this sort of rose hip, I don't want to say potpourri, that puts people off, but I do mean that in the nicest way. This sort of slightly floral, lovely muscati character comes through. I've done quite a big star here because it is a blend of 3 grapes that specialize in 3 different parts of the Peloponnese. The second grape in the blend is roditis. Really, I would argue the sort of go-to, can't go very wrong grape of Greece for me. And again, light pink skinned, but you don't have to get pink wine. You can get white wine as well. Very, very planted variety. I'm just thinking now, so this is planted in large quantities, but mainly in the Peloponnese amongst other places. And the main grape for Retsina that they use for the real workhorse stuff is a grape called Savatiano. And that's the most planted grape variety. But you can blend Roditis with Savatiano to make a much better version of Retsina. So it's worth bearing that in mind. But I like the Roditis that is single variety or blended with these other grapes to make, for example, our society's white Greek blend. It also goes into that and is sort of the shining star of that blend. One of the reasons it's so good and one of the reasons it works really well in a rosé is it ripens late, so you get lots of flavor character developed, but the acidity keeps really well in warm climates. So even though it ripens late, you still retain that acidity, which is, for me, rather fabulous. So let's talk about GNL. I'll mention briefly afterwards. Well, I can tell you now, there are international grapes grown in Greece, but that's not why any of us are here. In the total of Greece, about 85% of the varieties are indigenous. Yes, but there is about 15% planted to international varieties. The nice thing is, particularly for the whites, they usually blend a little bit of portion into an existing indigenous variety. Less so for the reds, because Cabernet Sauvignon gets quite a lot of airtime on the reds. But for whites, things like Chardonnay, Ugni Blanc, Sauvignon Blanc, sometimes a bit of Muscat, they might blend them into blends akin to what we've got here, something similar, where you're using a few grapes and picking out the nice characters. So as I mentioned, in this rosé, we have Roditis and we have moschofilero, so our 2 pink-skinned varieties. Pink skins are common in Greece, but it's not what's making this wine pink, just to confuse you. Roditis has brought us that lovely fresh acidity, like I mentioned, like late ripening, but very high acid. And the perfume that gorgeous perfume is largely coming from the moschofilero. It is a partnership, but it's made in the one of the gentleman's winery, Quintones. So George Quintones and Leonidas Nasaiokos, and they make it in the Peloponnese region, as I mentioned. The largest number of appellations, so quality appellations, can be found in the Peloponnese. It does mean that there's a lot of varieties. The Peloponnese itself, so the big sort of entire region, should we say, is actually a PGI. I was about to say IGP. So if we have time, I'll go into the difference of those, but really you can sort of classify them as like sort of less quality and identity in the PGIs, and then there's a handful of these PDOs, which is where the top sort of regional identifiable top quality stuff comes from. And so Santorini is one. Our xinomavro, I think, is actually not. I think it's an IGP because it's Macedonia. Yeah, it is. But you can get plenty of xinomavro made by this producer. That's one of the appellations like Rapsani or Nausa. We'll go into that in a bit. But this is a Peloponnese wine at large because it's a blend of a few places rather than of one place. But as I've already mentioned, the nice thing about this vast region of the Peloponnese, or you only have to look at a map to see that it's one of the bigger spots. It does mean that you're actually at the best spot for a lot of the grapes. So moschofilero, the pink-skinned one on that plateau at 600 meters high, keeping the acidity fresh. The roditis here comes from Patras, which is one of the most famous spots, makes it nice and acidic. It is an exclusive roditis appellation if it says Patras on the label, but as you know, this is a blend, so it doesn't. And then we have our red grape, and that is it's the red grape that haunts my nightmares. When I was recently with my MW study pals in Austria, there's quite a few Greek guys, and again, I kept asking them if I'm saying it right, and there is something about my brain that cannot say it. Agiorgitiko. There's something I can't do. I want to call it St. George, which is horrible because that's the silly anglicized name that everybody calls it. Agiorgitiko. Can't do it, can't be done. But you can see how it's spelt here. Splash of agiorgitiko. Mark's trying to give me advice. It can't be done, Mark. I've been schooled in it. Something about my brain can't get over it. I think I've said it wrong so many times now that it's ingrained. But this lovely grape, often referred to as St. George, is at its best in a region called Nemea, not far from the Corinth Canal, actually, which is the bit that separates the Peloponnese here from the rest of Greece. And it's arguably the area that has had the most investment in wine. So it's got this sort of high-end, really great stuff. And so therefore, it's, I would argue, the red grape that's seen the most investment by its very nature. And so it's really, really coming on strides. It's the most planted red grape. It's good for rosé production, as you can see. So let's talk about the rosé first, and then I'll move on to what sort of red wines it gives. But the grape itself doesn't naturally have that high acidity. So by picking early, which lots of people do when they're producing a rosé, you can actually retain some of that acid. And because it's grown at quite high elevation, which I mentioned was really important in Greece, you can get enough acidity. So for the reds, which we'll talk about in a moment, that means that we can get some slightly more age-worthy wines. For the rosés, it means we have gorgeous freshness. So let's give it a taste. You'll see here, Matthew's also said about the agiorgitiko, the lovely St. George grape variety, bringing some red currant as well. And I think that's true. It's not got, for me, so Grenache-based rosés, which I'm drinking a fair amount of in my life down in the Southern Rhone, particularly here. They have this sort of strawberry character, which can often smell quite confected. And the thing I love about this wine is it does not have that. It's got this really nice crunchy red fruit, pardon me, and then flowers on top, this floral character coming from the moschofilero. And then when I taste it now, I'm hoping that you get this really great zingy acidity. I know you do because I've tried it before, but I'm just hoping I get it again. So let's have a taste. It's quite tart, which I love. Again, we've got a summer wine, so I really apologize. I think I saw someone earlier saying they were in Edinburgh in the snow. It's not a snow wine, but it's also there's something really sunny about it, and even just tasting it, I'm instantly transported to feeling like it might possibly be warmer outside tomorrow. But it's got this incredible, for me, I love the combination of the tart with that slightly sweet floral, rose petal, honeysuckle, grapey character, quite frankly, but then this tartness and this sharpness that makes it really refreshing. I mean, I want to be sat enjoying this on a Greek shingle beach somewhere, or a Greek sandy beach, doesn't matter, I'll take any of them. But I think it's a really, really good quaffing wine. Orange blossom, oh, absolutely, Anna. I really do get that kind of like citrusy blossom, touch of grapefruit for sure. So I adore it. And Matthew helps the guys to blend this wine because it's they make our society's white, as I mentioned. The main difference I'll say with the society's white is there's more moschofilero. I mentioned the roditis as well, and obviously we don't put any red wine in, but yeah, it's gorgeous, it's fun. It's, for me, we've got 2 vintages of this, or we had 2 vintages of this for sale. It depends when you bought them, but I've got the 2021, which is the most up-to-date vintage, and it is really singing. And I'm just going to check the price on it again because I do think it's sorry, I've got the 2021, the old one, and it's really singing. And for £8.95, I mean, I can't even imagine what your 2022s are tasting like if you've bought more recently than me, because this is fresh as a daisy. And I don't think there's many Provence rosés under £10 that you could say that about. Right, let's go on to red grapes. Red grapes, we've already mentioned the grape that will not, oh, sorry, this is what the Peloponnese looks like if you want to know, but it's very vast. This is also a very small portion. It's such a big region that there is no sort of one size fits all photo. But what I will tell you is it's sunny, there are a lot of trees, and it makes me desperate to go to visit. Also, the soils are actually, that's worth mentioning, they're quite red, so they're quite suited to red varieties. Right, the grape that should not be named. Let's talk about now what happens with those grapes and red wine production. I've already suggested that naturally the acidity isn't that high. So you do want those higher elevation spots. With those high elevation spots, you then end up with, for anyone that's done my sort of altitude sessions, the higher in altitude, you get this big diurnal range, which can be great because you get really warm days with lots of sun exposure, but then you get the cool nights that keep the acidity. But one thing that also sometimes does is it can sometimes make the grape skins of red varietals a bit thicker in order to deal with the higher UV. Now, St. George, agiorgitiko, just not going to keep trying. It has some quite thick skins naturally, but also what then happened is a lot of the producers didn't really know what to do with it, and it became a bit trendy to very much bash these grapes around when they came into the winery. Long maceration times, really pummeling them a lot, lots of pump overs, lots of punch downs, really extracting those tannins. And you basically then had to put it in oak because the tannins were so intense. And what that meant is you sort of had a grape that tasted an awful lot like lots of other grapes around the world. So it lost a lot of character. It was high tannin, good acidity, but tasted of a lot of oak and of a lot of red fruits from ripe grapes that have basically been battered. And there's quite a few different schools of thought on how to treat this now. Some producers are doing slow macerations and a lot less temperature wise, so kind of cool and slow, and being much more gentle with it. Others are doing quick macerations, but they're not necessarily being so aggressive with the tannin manipulation. So a lot less oak is needed across the board. And actually what that's doing is giving this particular grape variety a chance to sing more and produce some really nice wines. So if you have chance to taste a St. George wine, agiorgitiko, that's the best I've ever done it, then please do. And if you've tasted one before and you've thought, oh, that just tastes like a big ripe old Cabernet, then please try again, because they are changing. And I got a yes from Mark. And on that note, it is often blended with Cabernet, particularly when you start to get further north. I mentioned that Cabernet has been a bit king in Greece, not only as a single varietal in non-Appellation wines, but there is some blending going on. Appellations tend to frown on the blending part though. So that is, I'm not going to risk it again, St. George. There's another variety, also even more dark, I should say, Limnio, and unsurprisingly native to the island of Limnos, but it is actually also now found in about to forget, is it Kaldaki? Yeah, in northeast Greece. Let me just check my map. Yes. But it's again sometimes blended with Cabernet. There's a bit of this trend, if you've got a big grape variety, let's put it with Cabernet, and it is a shame. But Limnio is very high, full body, quite high acidity, and quite herbaceous as well. You then have Mandelara. Mandelara is one of the varieties found down in the islands. It is very intense. I think this is where you would say that the hot climate and the hot style of grape are going hand in hand. The irony is that a lot of the very warm growing regions in Greece don't make big blockbuster wines like you find on the Douro and you find in the Southern Rhone and in Spain. A lot of them actually produce these beautiful light wines. Mandelaria is not that. Very deep coloured, very high tannins, so intense. You often have to blend it with another grape variety called Kotsifali to calm it down a bit. It mainly makes dry reds, but because it is so intense, you can actually make it into a sweet wine as well. Sweet wines are quite good on the islands, should we say, but it's rare and it's for locals. So if you get the opportunity, if you're traveling around the islands, you might get a chance to try it, but it is very, very rare. And that leads me on to probably the rising star of the Greek wine world in terms of red grapes, and I mean that in so many ways. It is now a little bit it is grown in a few places. I'd say that there are pockets, but the most famous probably is Nausa, where this producer is producing a lot of wine, and the grape variety is xinomavro. Xino means acid and mavro means black. So you'll often find a lot of the grapes are good descriptions if you speak better Greek than I do. But this is a real testament to the point I just made, that not all warm climates produce warm tasting grape varieties. And in fact, xinomavro in some years is a grape variety that doesn't actually achieve full ripeness. So sometimes it is not warm enough in this northern part in the Nausa, where I've just circled here, to actually get this grape variety fully ripe. Obviously, global warming is slightly changing the game a little bit, but historically that was genuinely a problem. There's really two types of well, there's several types, but there's two, in my mind, two types of quality xinomavro. I've done a compare to some other varieties for lots of the wines. So I'll start by saying the very full, quite extracted versions of this grape variety, such as Earth and Sky, which is the sort of hero wine of this producer, Apostolos Thimiopoulos. He Earth and Sky is like a Nebbiolo. You know, you look at it, it's quite pale, but you taste it and it's bitter but tart and delicious and tannic, and can age beautifully. And you really could say, wow, that's a Nebbiolo with a little bit of a strange tomato thing that goes on. And honestly, in blind tastings, I've had conversations with people. We had a really good xinomavro at MW Bootcamp a few weeks ago, and luckily I guessed it was xinomavro, but I couldn't quite work out why until I started writing tomatoes. And it's not the tomato itself, it's walking into a greenhouse. My granddad used to grow loads of tomatoes in his greenhouse, and it's that smell. And the moment I started writing that, I was like, it's not Nebbiolo, it's xinomavro. The other grape that it gets confused with is more in this style. Now, I don't think this particular wine does this job, but you could be forgiven for saying it's a little bit more Pinot Noir-like. So there are two styles, both great quality, don't get me wrong. This one is the lighter, fresher, less extracted, very easy drinking. I've suggested you could serve it chilled. Please do. I think it's a great idea to do so. And it's definitely more moving towards the Pinot Noir end. There is... this is a great representation of that style, but I really wanted to make you aware that there is a very, very serious style as well of xinomavro now that is taking on some of the finest red wines in the world, and particularly when you start to say it's rubbing shoulders with Nebbiolo on one side and Pinot Noir on the other, arguably two of the greatest red grapes. There's no argument about it. They are two of the greatest red grapes in the world. And the other thing is that it's really on trend at the moment, which is always a blessing and a curse. The curse is that I'm sure the prices will continue to rise. The blessing is it's a great variety that is far more available. And in fact, this producer, Apostolos Thimiopoulos, won the decanter. I think it's released. It is released. Phew. I was just thinking, well, I think it was released in January, but we knew for a couple of weeks before, but I think it was embargoed. He won the Decanter Rising Star Award. So of the entire world, he is the Decanter magazine's Rising Star winemaker. So let me quickly tell you about him, and then we'll enjoy it and go on to some questions. But it's his family produced wine for generations. But Apostolos's father was the first person, again, that started selling grapes commercially to local wineries. You see a pattern here. Apostolos then went off and studied in Athens. And then I've already mentioned the name of his sort of inaugural wine that he produced called Earth and Sky. He sold it in 2005, and it was the 2003 vintage. And it became kind of a cult wine from that moment, really. And he now produces a huge range of wines. He produces wines from a few different regions, but Nausa is his focal point. He makes wine from sorry, I'm just going to get the pictures up because I'd like to show you this, from old vines, and he focuses on biodynamics as well. So this isn't meant as a negative, but his wineries are not the prettiest, his vineyards are not the prettiest, but you can see they are covered in cover crops, excuse the pun, and there's a real natural thing going on. You can also see the elevation here. So this is in that northerly part in Nausa, and you can see the gnarled old vines barely being held up by a few trellis wires, letting that grass grow. So he's allowing some natural competition, but also sequestering lots of other minerals and all sorts of things and goodness into the soil nutrition. So he's very big on this. And I do think that it speaks volumes in his wine. It's also pretty hard through most of Greece to go anywhere without a giant mountain in the background. And his vineyards do have some of the most beautiful views. So enjoy. having a smell. I've still got a bit of that slightly tomatoey thing, but there's a lot of fruit character as well here, which is lovely. Lots of red, crisp, crunchy fruits, which are fabulous. And I think for me, I love this wine, and I think I've said it before because I have used this a couple of times in tastings. For me, this wine, it became our staple for most of lockdown. I don't know how he managed to continue to produce the volumes he did, because I feel like my husband and I bought most of what he produced. But he has, it has this lovely sort of freshness, but it's not a wimpy wine. It's still got seriousness, but you can enjoy it. You can enjoy it chilled in the garden. It is a brilliant barbecue wine, but it is also nice by itself. And not all red wines are that wonderful. James has just made a really, really interesting point. The serious examples are maybe for approaching in the longer term. I think that's a really good point that I hadn't addressed, James. Thank you. Young xinomavro, when it's the really top quality stuff, is tough. It's like drinking a Barolo young. It's like infanticide. You need to have a few years to let it come into balance. So, you know, already you heard that he released the 2003 and 2005. That's a young winemaker who needs to start making money quickly, and he still waited 2 years to release it. And then you're obviously encouraged to keep it as long as you want afterwards. Julia has a couple bottles of the Alta Nausa stashed away for a few years. Yeah, I think that's a really fair point. This is a young, easy drinking style, quality, but certainly easier to drink and approach when youthful. Not all of them are made like this. So gonna have a taste. It just always tastes like home for me. It tastes like I could have it in the garden. There's a slight smokiness, which I really like. John said he loved it, enjoyed it chilled on its own and with dinner. Wonderful discovery. I'm always irked. Do I tell more people about this wine? Do I keep it to myself? It has to be one of the best fine wines for a tenner that I can think of. There's just nothing more to say other than that. It's absolutely stonking. So let me just check how much it is. I think it's about to go up, but only a tiny bit. Yeah, £12.50. Honestly, there are very few wines that I think are this good, and you can keep it. We've put till 2025 here. You can keep this if you chose to, and if you liked this and you fancy trying it, then all of his other reds that we sell are absolutely wonderful. Earth and Sky is the classic, so if you want to try that, and do so. I said I'd mention international reds, but they're not wildly exciting. We've got Cabernet, we've mentioned that a few times. They also do grow some Cabernet Franc, Merlot, Grenache, Syrah, Sanso. So basically, if it's grown in the Rhone or it's grown in Bordeaux, they'll probably grow it. But quite rightly, the government don't shout about it. They're very proud. The Greek government had to get appellation sorted when it joined the EU. That's part of the rules of selling wine with when you join the EU. But they've been quite strict, and there are no Greek wine appellations that are PDO, so the top protected, that have international varieties at the heart of them. So whilst you can get some great wines from international varieties in Greece, they never get that top appellation status, and so it protects the indigenous varieties, which is great. So I've got some questions. I haven't got much time, so I'm going to have to be a little bit selective. Okay, so I've got one person asked what a PDO is, which I think is fair since I just mentioned it again. So if you imagine it like a triangle, PDO is like the AOC in France. So the easiest probable description most people would recognize is that PDO, the top of the tree, is like Châteauneuf-du-Pape, and the bottom of the tree, it's not the bottom, but the less protected, slightly more flexible rules, the bottom part of your wedge, is called PGI in Greece, and the equivalent, if we're talking about Châteauneuf-du-Pape, would be a Côte de Rhône. You can see the equivalents mostly around the world in price. It's quite easy to make the distinction. However, I've already slightly mentioned that sometimes it's not a perfect representation. So PDOs in Greece, there are 33 of those top ones. The only wine we tasted today that was a PDO was the Santorini. And that has to be within the area of Santorini, naturally, has to be assyrtiko, and will have certain other rules around it. And those are protected, and they're to keep the integrity of the area. PGI is just protected geographical indication. So PDO, I should mention, is protected designation of origin. They sound awfully similar. But the geographical or indication, pardon me, is much more flexible. You find a lot of blends. Hello. So this is a Peloponnese blend from different regions. You get other blends from places like Attica. But also, when you're not adhering to the exact rules of the appellation, you can then be a bit more flexible on what you're doing. So this is his young vines, and it's from... it's just IGP Macedonia. So this is actually not even a PG. Yeah, it is. Sorry. So this is from Macedonia. There'll be certain rules that he has broken on purpose that will not allow him to call it a Nausa. Now, I suspect it's because the grapes don't all come from Nausa in this case, but it might be, and I'm not saying that particular wine, but it might be that they've broken another rule. For example, they're using a different trellis system to what the rules permit, or they've added 10% of another grape variety, or they've what else? All sorts of things, and they start to get a bit weird and wonderful. But underneath that sits this unbelievably broad term, Greek table wine term called kava, which is basically high quality table wine, although there's no legal definition. So if you hear that used, kind of goes underneath that. Right. I've got a question on sweet wines, and I apologize. I touched on them and then I didn't explore them enough. So I will do a little bit about the varieties that we've talked about today, but I won't go into too much detail because we honestly could do a whole other session. I might encourage Matthew to do that. Sweet wines are made all over Greece, and there are lots of those indigenous pockets where you get a really specialist, unique sweet wine of a region that you would never pick up anywhere other than within about a 50-mile radius of that region. However, there are some exceptions to that rule. There are sweet muscats in particular from Samos and Limnos. I mentioned Limnos earlier. Those particular, so it's a muscat variety. Those two sweet wines are made as vin doux naturel, so they're lightly fortified. In fact, I'll send it in the roundup email, but we normally have a Samos VDN, a muscat of Samos, on our list, and it is groundbreaking. It's this sort of beautiful candied oranges, candied fruits. It's got low levels of alcohol compared. Someone's just written Samos is Christmas. Tell me about it. It's like orange peel, ginger, raisins. I said, if anybody did one of my Christmas sessions, it's my favorite wine, dare I say it, to pair with mince pies and Christmas pudding, but it's amazing with cheese as well. So those sweet muscats are amazing. And the other wine worth saying is, I mentioned it earlier, Vinsanto. You may think, Vinsanto is an Italian wine that they dry on straw mats and then they make into raisins, and you get this sort of unctuous, naturally sweet wine. Well, yes, but actually there's a lot of evidence that Vinsanto originated in Greece. And one of the most famous Vinsantos is actually from Santorini, Vinsanto Santorini. There might be something in that. Don't hold me to that, that's not a fact. But for that wine, it has to be minimum 51% of assyrtiko that we had earlier. So you've got that lovely, vibrant freshness, but dried into raisins for six to 8 days. So around a week, give or take. And they dry them into these beautiful raisins rather, dry the grapes into beautiful raisins, and then they press those and get this unctuous nectar. So if you get a chance to try Vinsanto from Santorini, please do. They are so expensive. So that is a little bit of a challenge. And then I'll have one more question because I've got 1 minute left. Because James has asked, will Cretan varietals get a mention? How about I just throw one in? We do have a really good Vidiano from Crete in at the moment. They're tiny production in Crete. Not a lot makes its way to us, but we do have a wine from Crete on the website. So I'm going to send that tomorrow as well. So I need to send you sweet wines and Cretan wines. And that is bang on 8 o'clock. So I apologize if I whipped through a few of the questions there. I hope that I managed to answer quite a few. I've also had a request to put ribolla in tomorrow's email if we have one. I don't know if we have one at the moment, but if there's anything worth trying in our Greek collection, I am going to put it in the email. So fear not. And then I will answer one more question before we go. And all of that to say, I've just had an anonymous question that there's no online events after the end of this month on the website. Don't worry, members. We're going to take April off on the online team. I'm sadly leaving at the end of March. I'm moving to the Southern Rhone, so I will have to sadly bid farewell whilst we're getting everything together for my leaving. Through the month of April, there won't be any online events, but we've actually already started putting dates into the calendar for May, and there's things like, and I hope I'm not blowing the whistle too early or whatever we want to say. We've got an event with Barbarani from Umbria, which will be amazing. That's coming in May. We've got a session with Matthew Horsley, our buyer for Greece. He's going to do a session on botrytis, which will be fascinating. We've got a Pinot Noir taste along coming down the tracks, so watch out for that. There's absolutely masses, so don't be afraid. Don't be worried just because I'm gone. Things will continue. They're just going to kick off from the first week of May, having had a bit of hiatus to regroup. So hope you enjoyed. It's been an absolute pleasure for me. I'm going to go and finish my glass of assyrtiko, which actually, with such light and refreshing wines, I think I can come back to. It wouldn't be the same if I'd had Vinsanto, that's for sure. But I can come back to my assyrtiko in peace now. So have a lovely rest of the evening, members. If you haven't already had your dinner, then I hope you enjoy it. Food-friendly wines all around here. And have a lovely rest of the evening. And I hope to see you again soon.